The year was vast. And the year was terrifying. So begins Bulgakov's haunting memory of 1918, a year carved into Russian history like a wound that never fully healed. The year of Christ's nativity, he writes, and the first full year after the revolution, a year heavy with sun in the summer, and drowned in snow in the winter. And above that wounded land stood two watchful sentinels. The bright, pastoral glow of Venus and the trembling scarlet spark of Mars. One a symbol of calm, the other a herald of war, shining over a nation that no longer knew the difference between dawn and disaster. The poetic image feels almost unreal, yet it is painfully literal. For in 1918, the entire world of Russia, its cities, its villages, its families, its armies, its very identity, had been torn apart. The old order was dead. The new order was not yet born. And between them stretched a chasm filled with fire, famine, hope, rage, faith, betrayal, delirium, and blood. This was not merely a civil war. It was a break in reality. The revolution had promised a new beginning. Instead, it unleashed something ancient and uncontrollable in the human soul, something that slept for centuries beneath the veneer of empire, now awakened and hungry. Across the country, the conflict between reds and whites swayed like a scale suspended from the heavens, pulled this way and that by armies that grew overnight and evaporated just as quickly. One front collapsed while another surged. Red victories turned to ashes, white successes dissolved into panic. Every triumph carried the taste of doom. People alive during those months described the feeling in their diaries. Every day begins in fear and ends in rumors. You cannot trust the sun. It shines on the dead as if nothing happened. The world has lost its center. The map changes faster than newspapers can print. And perhaps the most chilling, everyone is waiting on, but no one knows for what. A land of broken time. To understand what it meant to live in 1918, you must imagine a country where time itself had broken apart. Trains vanished into the steppe without explanation. Entire regiments dissolved into the forests, taking their rifles and their officers with them. Villages changed hands 5 times in a week. One night you slept under a red banner, the next morning you woke up to the sound of white cavalry. No law stayed the same for more than a month. No currency held value. No alliance lasted. No promise meant anything. A peasant might hand bread to red soldiers in the afternoon, only to bury that same soldier at dusk after a skirmish with white partisans. A factory worker might swear loyalty to the Soviets at a rally, then disappear into the crowd to avoid conscription. A noble family might flee east with white officers, only to return weeks later when the Red Army retook the town, pretending they had never left. Everyone acted. Everyone lied. Everyone survived in the only way they could. This was the true face of the Russian Civil War, not uniforms and speeches, but confusion, improvisation, terror, and the quiet hope that the next sunrise might bring order at last. A nation of whispers. By the end of the summer of 1918, Russia had become a country held together not by government or faith or army, but by rumor. Rumor moved faster than trains. Rumor killed faster than bullets. Rumor was the new currency of fear. Kolchak is marching on Moscow. The Germans are coming back. The Red Army has dissolved. The Tsar is alive. Petrograd has fallen. The Czechs control the railroads. The British are landing in Arkhangelsk. The Bolsheviks have a new secret weapon. Denikin is dead. Denikin is alive. Denikin is already in Kiev. A million versions of the truth spun wildly across the land. And as each rumor collided with another, the country's sense of reality cracked a little more. For the first time in centuries, the Russian Empire, once so large it could swallow entire nations, found itself swallowed by its own uncertainty. This is the world into which our story descends. To stars above the fire. And yet, despite the chaos on the ground, the sky above remained strangely calm. Venus is shining with soft, shepherd's light. Mars are flickering like a wound that refused to close. Peasants in the fields whispered that the 2 stars were omens. One promising salvation, the other foretelling destruction. Old women crossed themselves. Soldiers joked to hide their fear. Astronomers wrote dry reports about planetary alignment, pretending not to hear the cannon fire rolling in the distance. But whether one believed in signs or not, those stars became symbols exactly as Bulgakov intended. Symbols of a country split between 2 visions of its future. One glowing with hope, one vibrating with violence. That duality, that contradiction, is the essence of 1918. It is why history still trembles when we speak of it. The curtain rises on our story. And so, as the smoke of battle thickens and the illusion of peace collapses, we step into the second act of Russia's greatest tragedy. This is the year when the Civil War stops being a political struggle and becomes a war of survival. In this chapter of our journey, we will reconstruct the events of that fateful year through the voices of those who witnessed it. The soldiers who froze in trenches. The commanders who gambled with entire provinces. The civilians who hid in cellars as the front rolled over their homes again and again. The writers, poets, and statesmen who tried to understand the madness unfolding before them. But before we can follow them into the flames, we must study the battlefield itself. Because by the end of the summer of 1918, Russia was no longer a single country, it was a shattered mosaic of powers, territories, armies, and foreign interventions. And maps, unlike rumors, do not lie. To understand the Russian Civil War, one must first understand a brutal truth. Russia in 1918 was no longer a country. It was a body torn limb from limb, each fragment still twitching with its own ambitions, fears, and illusions of power. A map printed in any newspaper of the era was not a description of reality. It was an argument with reality. Lines shifted faster than ink could dry. Fronts bent and broke like glass under pressure. Colors bled into one another: red, white, gray, foreign blue, German black, Cossack green, until the entire empire resembled a wounded animal clawed open from all sides. But let us look closely, patiently, as if holding the map under a flickering kerosene lamp in a cold railway carriage, the way many commanders studied it then, while the earth shook under distant artillery. Because only by understanding this fractured world can we follow the story that unfolds across it. The Red Court, a beating heart under siege. At the center of the map, like a heart still beating beneath rubble, lay the lands controlled by the Bolsheviks. A tight, fragile core. Moscow, Petrograd, parts of the Volga, bits of the North Caucasus, and scraps of Turkestan. It was not much. For a revolution that claimed the entire nation, the actual territory under Soviet control looked insultingly small. A few arteries, key railways, vital cities, industrial zones kept the new government alive, pumping what little manpower and grain they possessed. Every direction from this red core led to danger. West are the Germans, east are the Whites, north are the British and French, south are the Cossacks and Denikin's volunteers. The Bolsheviks were not ruling Russia in 1918. They were surviving within it, one hard winter or failed harvest away from collapse. And yet, survival was enough. As history would prove, the Red Corps would not shrink, it would expand. But that future seemed impossible to imagine in the late summer of that year. The East, a foreign sword in Russian hands from Kazan to Siberia, and all the way to the Pacific Ocean, stretched a territory that did not obey Moscow, and not entirely the Whites either. This was the land of foreign intervention, local warlords, improvised governments, railroad commanders, and the restless Czechoslovak Legion. The Czechs, as they were called, had once marched across Russia as allies, foreign soldiers stranded by the collapse of the Eastern Front. But by 1918, they were acting as the skeleton of white power across the Volga and Siberia. They held the trains, the depots, the bridges. In a country defined by distance, he who controlled the railways controlled destiny. Around them swirled white administrations. The Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly. The Provisional Siberian Government. Regional atamans with their own private armies. And, looming over them all, Admiral Kolchak, the self-proclaimed supreme ruler of Russia. Yet even Kolchak, with his polished uniform and foreign support, ruled less like a czar and more like a captain of a ship in a storm, the wheel ripped from his hands each time he regained it. Siberia was not loyal. It was merely tired of chaos, and Kolchak seemed, for a moment, like the least chaotic option. That moment would not last. The South, a banner of white and Cossack blue. If the East was unstable, the South was burning. Here, the volunteer army, the core of the white movement, marched under the command of Generals Alexeyev, Denikin, Kornilov, and later Wrangel. Their men were few but fiercely disciplined. Their officers were veterans of empires and ideals that no longer existed. Their soldiers fought not for pay or plunder but out of conviction, a conviction sharpened by hatred of Bolshevik terror. Alongside them stood the Cossack hosts, the Don, the Cuban, the Terek, military nations within a nation, proud, restless, suspicious, and heavily armed. Together, the Whites and Cossacks formed the most dangerous force the Bolsheviks faced in the South, a blade pointed directly at the Red Heartland, one that would soon drive toward Tsaritsyn, toward Ukraine, and ultimately toward Moscow itself. The Southern Front was not merely a battlefield. It was a furnace, forging heroes, monsters, martyrs, and tyrants. And its flames would define the next chapter of the war. The West, a Germany's shadow over a dying empire. To the West lay lands that technically were no longer part of Russia at all, not in any meaningful sense. Germany, still fighting the First World War, had occupied Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, and parts of the Black Sea coast. The German Empire did not care about Bolsheviks or whites. It cared about grain, coal, and oil, the fuel it desperately needed to keep its own war alive. Thus, entire regions of the former Russian Empire found themselves ruled by foreign officers, foreign laws, foreign interests. Ukrainian cities flew German flags. Baltic ports served German supply ships. Belarusian villages fed German soldiers. It was colonial occupation disguised as temporary necessity. And when Germany collapsed in November 1918, the vacuum left behind would unleash a chaos so violent and unpredictable that even seasoned commanders were stunned by how quickly the entire western frontier caught fire. That story will soon become central in our narrative. The North had flags of Britain and France in the frozen fog. Far above the Arctic Circle, where the sun barely rose and the forests whispered with cold, two more colors appeared on the map. The Union Jack and the tricolor of France. Foreign troops of British, French, American, and Canadian who landed in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Their stated mission: to protect military supplies and prevent Bolshevik Russia from aiding Germany. Their real mission was less clear. Some white officers believed the Allies would save Russia. Some Bolsheviks believed the Allies wanted to carve it up. The Allies themselves mostly wanted to go home. Yet their presence turned the Russian North into another front, another bleeding edge in a nation losing blood from all sides. A nation of governments, but no government. That was the map of Russia in 1918. Not one country, but a dozen overlapping countries. Every color on that map represented not stability, but tension. Every border was temporary. Every alliance was conditional. Every stronghold was one bad harvest or one good raid away from collapse. Standing before such a map, one could understand why people whispered, "Russia has become too large for itself. The land is breaking under its own weight. No one rules Russia. Russia only endures." This was the reality the Bolsheviks faced. This was the battlefield the whites hoped to exploit. This was the stage on which the greatest internal conflict of the 20th century would unfold. And into this fractured landscape steps a new voice, a witness whose words capture the moral ruin spreading across the land. Before the gunfire, before the cavalry charges, before the infamous battles that would define the Civil War, there was something else, as something quieter, more invisible, and infinitely more terrifying. A collapse not of armies, but of conscience. If maps showed how Russia fractured in space, the words of Ivan Bunin showed how it fractured in spirit. His diaries from 1918 read like the witness account of a man watching the sky fall in slow motion, unable to stop it, unable to look away. Bunin did not write from a battlefield. He did not command forces or negotiate treaties. He watched. And what he saw was more horrifying than artillery or executions. He saw a society losing its moral gravity. A nation where the good grew helpless. Bunin observed something that terrified him far more than political upheaval, a spiritual inversion of values. The decent, the gentle, the hardworking, the principled suddenly found themselves without strength, without direction, without protection. Their virtues became liabilities. He wrote, "The hands of the righteous grew faint, while the wicked found their courage." It was not simply that criminals roamed the streets. It was that ordinary people learned to behave like criminals, not out of malice, but out of fear. Imagine a village in 1918. A red detachment marches through, demands grain for the revolution, and the villagers give it. 2 days later, a white patrol arrives and demands the same. The villagers give again. Then a local partisan gang comes at night, claiming to fight for freedom. The villagers give once more. Then the Bolsheviks return, accusing the village of aiding counter-revolution. Punishment follows. Then the whites accuse them of aiding the Reds. Punishment follows again. Suddenly, decades of trust, decency, and cooperation evaporate. Neighbors begin to hide food from neighbors. People whisper behind shutters. A stranger on the road is no longer a traveler, he is a threat. A knock on the door after midnight means death. This is the world Bunin lived in. A world in which morality was no longer a compass because the landscape itself had lost its directions. The rise of the wicked while the righteous were paralyzed. Bunin saw another phenomenon. The rise of those who had always been kept at society's margins are the violent, the jealous, the resentful, the ambitious without talent, the cruel without purpose. For centuries they had been powerless. Suddenly they were told they were heroes. And they believed it. Men who once stole chickens were now guardians of revolutionary justice. Teenagers with no education became people's commissars, issuing death sentences on instinct. Former criminals led armed squads, deciding the fate of entire towns. Drunks became ideologues. Fools became executioners. Liars became orators. Cowards became tyrants. Bunin wrote of mobs rolling across the land under flags they barely understood, convinced that history itself blessed their greed and rage. He was not exaggerating. Across Russia, revolutions, a Bolshevik, anti-Bolshevik, anarchist, nationalist gave people something dangerously intoxicating. Permission. Permission to avenge old grudges. Permission to take what they wanted. Permission to kill without guilt. The Civil War did not begin with battles. It began with unleashed human nature. 1,000 private revenges. Bunin understood something many generals and politicians did not. The Civil War was not one war, it was millions of tiny wars, each fought in kitchens, barns, sheds, basements, alleys, forest clearings. A peasant shot his neighbor because the neighbor had once laughed at him. A factory worker informed on a foreman who fired him 3 years earlier. A group of teenagers stabbed a teacher they hated. A widow denounced a merchant who refused her credit. A group of men stormed the estate of a landlord, not because he was a tyrant, but because he had once turned them away from his orchard. Revolution granted legitimacy to grievances no one should ever have acted upon. And Bunin saw it happening everywhere. He wrote that people acted as if the world had ended, and what remained was merely the settling of accounts. The psychology of collapse. What makes Bunin's testimony so powerful is not its anger, though he was furious, but its clarity. He recognized patterns. Fear becomes normal. People adapt to terror faster than anyone expects. Violence becomes casual. Not heroic, not dramatic. Just something that happens between one chore and another. Truth becomes irrelevant. When survival is at stake, facts are luxuries. Loyalty disappears. Families split. Friends betray. Neighbors inform on each other. Ideology becomes an excuse. Men shout slogans not because they believe them, but because the slogans justify what they already intended to do. And most importantly, people stop believing the future exists. When tomorrow looks like today, only worse. The mind collapses long before the body does. Bunin captured all of this with a merciless pen. He wrote not merely about events, but about the death of a civilization's soul. And yet his writing was not despairing. It was diagnostic, like a doctor describing a plague. A plague not of germs, but of hatred, fear, and moral disintegration. Soldiers, too, lost themselves. The moral collapse Bunin described was not limited to civilians. The army, or rather, the ruins of what had once been an army, has suffered a similar decay. Desertion became normal. Looting became expected. Officers fled their posts. Entire battalions changed sides overnight. Fronts dissolved without a single shot. Reports sent to commanders described scenes that felt unreal. Artillery units abandoning their guns and disappearing into forests. Regiments marching home in broad daylight, ignoring orders. Soldiers killing their commanders and electing new ones on a whim. Local militias fighting their own supposed allies. Troops bargaining with both Reds and Whites for supplies. This was not war. This was entropy in uniform. The moral rot Bunin observed in homes and towns spread into barracks and trenches like wildfire. But moral collapse was only one dimension of the catastrophe. While Bunin's pen captured the decay of society, armies continued to clash across the continent. One of those armies, a disorganized, starving, dissolving under its own weakness, was the Red Army of early 1918. To understand how the Bolsheviks managed to hold even a fragment of the country together, we must examine the state of their forces, the chaos, the desertion, the failures, and the desperate measures that followed. If one were to choose a single word to describe the Red Army in the late summer and autumn of 1918, that word would not be army. Not yet. Not even close. It would be chaos. Because before the Reds could ever dream of winning the Civil War, before they could think of sweeping offensives, armored trains, propaganda triumphs, or heroic legends, they had to overcome a far more dangerous enemy than Denikin or Kolchak: their own disintegration. The Bolsheviks ruled cities, but they did not rule the countryside. They held Moscow, but they did not hold the minds of the men they were trying to conscript. They had weapons, but not the discipline to use them as a coherent force. What they had was a collection of armed crowds, revolutionary in spirit, undisciplined in action, and unreliable in almost everything else. And as the White armies gathered strength, as foreign interventions multiplied, as entire regions slipped from their grasp, the Bolsheviks faced a nightmare possibility. The Red Army might melt away before the war truly began. The vanishing army. The desperate reports began flowing into Moscow like cold wind seeping through broken windows. From Petrograd, regiments refuse to march. Soldiers demand to return home. From the Volga, division strength is half what it should be. Desertions daily. From the Urals, commanders intimidated by their own men. From the Southern Front, units appear on paper but do not exist in reality. Commanders wrote in despair, "We cannot hold the line. We have no officers. We have no cartridges. We have no obedience." Entire battalions disappeared overnight, some scattering into villages, some joining partisans, others riding off to whichever side promised bread. And those who remained often obeyed only one rule: do whatever keeps you alive until tomorrow. Nothing more. The legend and the truth. Soviet mythology would later paint the Red Army of 1918 as a force of fiery idealists, marching in step beneath red banners, inspired by revolutionary conviction. The reality was different, more human, and far more tragic. Yes, there were idealists. Yes, there were heroes. But the bulk of the army was made of the same exhausted, frightened peasants who had already survived one world war and had no desire to die in another. They wanted to go home. They wanted to see their families. They wanted the land that had been promised for years. And so they deserted. Thousands a day. Tens of thousands a month. For every platoon formed, another dissolved. For every regiment raised, another evaporated. The army was like sand slipping through the fingers of a government still learning how to hold anything at all. Commissars without control. The Bolsheviks tried to maintain discipline through political commissars, guardians of ideology placed beside every commander to ensure loyalty to the revolution. But in the early months, commissars were often young, inexperienced, and frightened. Their words carried little authority among soldiers who had survived the trenches of the Great War. Many units openly mocked them. Some threatened them. Some ignored them entirely. A few commissars were lynched by mutinous soldiers. Even Lenin, receiving reports late at night in his dim-lit Kremlin office, remarked bitterly, "We have an army in name, but names do not fight." The call for help. Enter the old officers. Faced with collapse, the Bolsheviks made a decision that shocked their own supporters. They turned to former Tsarist officers. The same class enemies they had demonized only months before were now invited or forced into service. Thousands of them. Some joined out of patriotism. Some out of fear. Some because they saw no other path to survival. But for every officer who reported for duty, Moscow received 3 warnings of treason, murmurs of sabotage, whispers of betrayal. The Bolsheviks feared the officers. The officers feared the Bolsheviks. The soldiers distrusted them both. This uneasy alliance would define the Red Army's character and create the explosive tensions that would soon give rise to a new institution, the ruthless counterintelligence officers known as Osobusti. But that is a story for a later chapter. Sietis. The commander standing on crumbling ground at the center of this storm was a man rarely remembered today, yet crucial in 1918. Joachim Sietis, the first commander-in-chief of the Red Army. A Latvian rifleman of iron discipline and cold logic, he was tasked with forging an army from fragments of rebellion. He read the reports, saw the truth clearly, and wrote to Lenin with brutal honesty. "We do not have an army. We have a mob with rifles. We cannot hold the Eastern Front much longer. Without discipline, all ideology is nothing." Lenin did not always appreciate the tone, but he trusted the man. Because Sietis was one of the few commanders who did not lie to make the situation look better. And the situation was catastrophic. The collapse at the front. On the Volga, Red divisions fled before the advancing Czechoslovak Legion. At Simbursk and Kazan, entire units vanished under fire. On the southern front, Red detachments abandoned trenches without raising their rifles. Reports of panic multiplied. Reports of mutiny followed. The Bolsheviks realized with horror that every enemy seemed stronger than the Reds. The Whites had morale, the Czechs had discipline, the foreign troops had coordination, and the national movements had unity. The Reds had slogans. And slogans did not stop cavalry charges. The revolution itself was in danger. The birth of desperation. Lenin summoned meetings late into the night. Trotsky paced like a caged animal on his armored train. Commissars argued in smoky rooms lit by a single flickering lamp. They all understood. If discipline was not restored immediately, the Red Army would dissolve. And with it, the Bolshevik state. Something drastic had to be done. Something unprecedented. Something that would change the war forever. Trotsky believed he knew exactly what that was. And soon, with the ringing of a single order, he would drag the Red Army out of chaos. Not by inspiring it. Not by reforming it. But by terrifying it into unity. What he unleashed would become one of the most feared tools of the revolution. There are moments in history when one person walks into a room and the temperature changes. The air tightens. The walls seem to lean closer. The entire future tilts in a new direction. In the summer of 1918, on the collapsing, terrified fronts of the Red Army, that person was Lev Davidovich Trotsky. Not Lenin. Not Stalin. Not the generals inherited from the empire. But Trotsky, the man who would turn a disintegrating militia into a force capable of reshaping the fate of a continent. Before his arrival, the Red Front was a graveyard of plans. Units deserted. Commanders argued or fled. Peasants refused to fight for a government that had not yet proven it could outlive the weak. Ammunition disappeared. Cavalry wandered off. An entire artillery regiment once abandoned its guns and marched home. The war was being lost not by defeat, but by entropy. And so, in July of 1918, Lenin summoned the one man he believed could impose order on chaos, fear on apathy, discipline on dust. He summoned Trotsky. The arrival. A train of steel, and he did not ride to the front like a general. He arrived like a storm. In a train plated with steel sheets, armed with machine guns, crewed by elite guards and typists and telegraph operators and commissars, Trotsky moved across Russia like a relentless, metallic heartbeat. Wherever the armored train stopped, rumors ran ahead of him. Trotsky is here. He shoots deserters himself. He can talk for hours without stopping. He sleeps 3 hours a night. He knows every soldier's name. He knows no fear. Some of these rumors were lies. Some were exaggerations. Many were true. But together, they forged the single thing the Red Army lacked above all: a sense of inevitability. Trotsky did not merely restore order. He created the mythology of order. He spoke to crowds of exhausted soldiers not like an officer, but like a prophet with a burning heart. He shamed them, inspired them, threatened them, praised them, and demanded from them a discipline they themselves did not believe possible. His speeches were not soft. They cut like bayonets. And the soldiers, desperate, cold, hungry, lost listened. Order No. 18. The harvest of iron. Trotsky's first great act was one of brutality. The army had been evaporating. Men left the trenches in the night. Entire companies vanished into forests and villages. Officers begged for reinforcements that did not exist. So Trotsky issued Order No. 18. It declared that anyone deserting the battlefield would be shot. Any commander retreating without orders would be shot. Entire units that abandoned their positions would be decimated. And behind the front, barrier detachments would stand ready to execute cowards on sight. Merciless. Yes. But in a war where armies dissolved like mist, mercy was a luxury neither side possessed. Under the glow of his hardened eyes, soldiers returned to their trenches. Retreat halted. Officers straightened their shoulders. Regiments that had been ghosts reassembled. Fear can be a terrible fuel, but it is still fuel. And the Red Army, for the first time, began to burn with something resembling resolve. The new military order. Trotsky reorganized the army not as a revolutionary militia, but as a professional and forgiving machine. Former Tsarist officers were brought back into service not as volunteers, but as hostages of their own families, who were kept as guarantees. Political commissars were placed beside every commander, given equal authority and absolute loyalty to the party. Punitive units, made of fanatics and criminals willing to kill for reward or ideology, patrolled the rear lines. Special trains, loaded with ammunition, reserves, and execution squads, raced from crisis to crisis. Red propaganda teams, with printing presses and loudspeakers, flooded frontline camps with stories of honor, betrayal, sacrifice, and vengeance. The Bolshevik state did not merely send armies to the front. It sent a worldview. The Red Army became the beating heart of the revolution, the lever that would either lift the future or crush those who opposed it. And at its center stood Trotsky. Relentless, gifted, fanatical, terrifying. A new kind of general before the war, Trotsky was a writer, a journalist, an orator. His weapons had been ink and words. He had never commanded a company, let alone an army. But the Civil War forged him into something unique, neither a classical general nor a mere propagandist. He became a symbol of organized willpower. His talent was not tactics. It was cohesion. He could make men believe that defeat was impossible, not because victory was guaranteed, but because failure had consequences more immediate and terrifying than the enemy's bullets. His presence turned broken fronts into fighting fronts. His absence turned strong positions into unraveling ones. Even his enemies admitted, where Trotsky goes, the Red Army stands. The front stabilizes and the war changes shape. By autumn of 1918. The situation that had seemed hopeless began to transform. Regiments held their ground. Deserters were fewer. Railways began to function. Supplies arrived. Armored trains multiplied. Commanders obeyed. The Red Corps, fragile, besieged, trembling, and stiffened. For the first time, the Bolsheviks could do more than endure. They could plan. The white offensives that once swept across the Volga met resistance. Cossack raids no longer found empty trenches. Cities that changed hands like cards in a gambler's fist began to stay in red hands. The revolution, which had nearly bled out in its first year, inhaled deeply, sharply, violently. Now it was ready to exhale. And that breath would carry devastation across the land. But before that turning point came, the Bolshevik leadership would take one final, decisive step, one that would change the very structure of the state. A step that would militarize not just the army, but the entire country. In the late summer of 1918, as the fronts trembled and the fate of the revolution balanced on a knife's edge, one grim realization began to crystallize in Moscow. Russia could no longer be governed as a country. It had to be commanded as a fortress. The Bolsheviks did not reach this conclusion through theory, debate, or ideology. They reached it because the earth beneath their feet was collapsing. Towns were changing hands in days. The East had erupted. The South was aflame. The North hummed with foreign accents. The West was a continental wound left by Germany's retreat. The Red government looked at the map of their shrinking state and saw not a country but a siege. And so, on September 2, 1918, the Soviet Republic was officially declared. A single armed camp. Those 5 words would reshape Russia more profoundly than any decree since October 1917. The birth of the revolutionary military machine. By nightfall of that same day, an institution emerged that would soon dominate every armed struggle and every political decision in the country. The Revolutionary Military Council. The Revensovit. The RVSR. It was not a ministry. It was not a committee. It was not even an army staff in the traditional sense. It was the central nervous system of a new kind of state, a war state, a command state, a state where the line between soldier and civilian dissolved. From this moment on, railroads became arteries of mobilization. Factories became barracks. Villages became recruiting grounds. Cities became strongholds. Schools became training camps. And every grain of wheat, every bullet, every boot was now counted as a military asset. The revolution was no longer political. It had become militarized in its very soul. Sietis, the first supreme commander of the Red Armies, at the top of this newly forged pyramid stood an unexpected figure. Joachim Sietis, a former colonel of the Imperial Army, a Latvian rifleman, and one of the few old officers the Bolsheviks trusted. Thin, sharp-featured, iron-willed, he was appointed the first commander-in-chief of all Soviet forces. His signature appeared on the most urgent orders. Reorganize the fronts, restore discipline, punish desertion, salvage collapsing units. He knew the task was almost impossible. He also knew there was no other choice. Because the Red Army was not yet an army. It was a crowd wearing uniforms. Sietis would spend months welding that crowd into something capable of resisting the approaching storm from Kazan in the east, from Denikin in the south, from Yaroslavl, Archangельsk, the Don, the Urals. But even the strictest commander cannot hold a fractured nation together alone. For that, the revolution had another instrument. Trotsky ascends of the Iron Order in the armored train. If Lenin was the mind of the revolution, and Vsetis its hand, then Leon Trotsky became its voice, as sharp as a blade, brilliant as a torch, merciless as fire. By 1918, Trotsky's armored train, a part mobile headquarters, part propaganda stage, part execution chamber, had become the most feared and legendary machine on the rails of Russia. A rolling fortress of steel, steam banners, and loudspeakers. Wherever the front was breaking, the armored train appeared like a specter. Out stepped Trotsky. Black leather coat. Round spectacles glinting. A notebook full of names. A revolver he rarely needed to fire. A voice that could command a regiment or condemn a deserter with equal force. Trotsky understood something few Bolsheviks did. Wars are not won only by guns. They are won by belief. And Trotsky turned belief into ammunition. He visited collapsing divisions, stood upon locomotives, climbed barrels, shouted into the faces of trembling soldiers. There is nowhere to retreat. Behind you is Russia. In front of you only death or victory. Some argued. Some obeyed. Some mutinied. But most listened because in those desperate months, Trotsky sounded less like a commissar and more like a prophet whose words held up the sky. The revolution learns to march under the combined authority of the RVSR, VCIETIS, Trotsky, and Lenin's cabinet in Moscow. A transformation took place, painful, brutal, but effective. The Red Army began to harden. Inkos emerged from the rank and file. Former Tsarist officers, supervised by commissars, returned to command posts. Factories learned to repair locomotives under bombardment. Peasants who had never seen a map were trained to coordinate attacks across hundreds of kilometers. Newspapers spoke of the people in arms. Secret police reports spoke of something darker. A military nation forming under duress. Both descriptions were true. The Bolsheviks were not building an army. They were building a system, one that would one day become one of the most formidable military institutions of the 20th century. But in 1918, it was still an experiment held together by fear, improvisation, and sheer willpower. The price of transformation. Obedience or oblivion. As the revolution militarized, so too did its methods. The decrees sharpened. The punishments intensified. The logic hardened. If the state is a fortress, then every citizen is a soldier. If every citizen is a soldier, then disobedience is treason. Railway workers who misrouted supply trains were tried as saboteurs. Peasants caught hoarding grain were labeled COUNTERREVOLUTIONARIES. Commanders who hesitated were relieved or worse. Regional councils received orders as from headquarters, not parliaments. It was a transformation not only of structures, but of psychology. The revolution had entered a new phase. War communism, a regime defined by requisition, mobilization, centralization, and the belief that survival justified anything, even terror. But that will be the subject of later chapters. For now, understand this. September 1918 was the moment the Bolsheviks stopped ruling and began marching. The world takes notice. Foreign observers in Petrograd and Moscow sent stunned reports to their governments. The Bolsheviks behave as if they control more territory than they do. They have reshaped the apparatus of the state into a weapon. Whatever they lack in men, they replace with intensity. Some thought the experiment would collapse within months. Some feared it would spread across Europe. No one foresaw that the Soviet war state would outlive every foreign army then fighting on Russian soil. But in 1918, none of that was certain. Everything trembled. Everything felt temporary. And the newly militarized Soviet Republic still faced enemies far stronger than itself. Because an army state forged in emergency does not survive on organization alone. It survives on fear directed outward and inward. And soon, after an assassination attempt on Lenin and the murder of key party leaders, the Bolsheviks would unleash a force darker and more uncompromising than any decree, any commander, any armored train. The map would change. The laws would change. The revolution itself would change. There are years in history when fear becomes a policy. There are months when hatred becomes a profession. But there are only a handful of moments when a government decides openly, deliberately, proudly that the killing of its own people is not a crime, but a necessity. For Soviet Russia, that moment came in the autumn of 1918. The trigger was small in scale but volcanic in consequence. An assassin's bullet in Petrograd, a shot fired at Lenin, the wounded architect of the revolution, staggering but alive. And in Moscow, the murder of the Cheka commander Uritsky. 2 acts of violence in a country already drowning in violence, but symbolic enough to crack the last restraints of the new regime. Within hours, the Bolsheviks stopped whispering about repression. They began to shout it. Within days, they stopped hiding the executions. They printed the lists in newspapers. Within weeks, they stopped pretending that terror was an emergency measure. They declared it a weapon of class justice. Thus began the Red Terror, not as a secret, not as a rumor, but as an institution. The birth of an iron policy. The orders fell like hammer blows. From the desks of Sverdlov and Dzerzhinsky, signed in crimson ink, came clear instructions to every Cheka branch across the country. Take hostages from the bourgeoisie, the clergy, the officers, the merchants. Shoot anyone involved in conspiracies. Shoot anyone suspected. Shoot without hesitation. The words were not ambiguous. They were not metaphorical. They were written exactly as they sounded. Factories, schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks were combed for class enemies. People were seized not for acts, but for categories. Not for crimes committed, but for the jobs their fathers once held, or the number of rooms in their apartments, or the way they looked, or the books they read. The criteria shifted from city to city, often decided by hunger, suspicion, or the personal grudges of the local Chekists. The figures imperfect, incomplete, but horrifying to speak with more honesty than memoirs. Tens of thousands shot in the first months. Hundreds of thousands arrested. Entire regions held hostage. And behind every number stood a story no statistic could capture. The architecture of fear. To understand the terror, one must imagine the geography of it, the physical spaces where it unfolded. Basements with dripping pipes. School buildings turned into jails. Abandoned mansions where chandeliers hung above execution chambers. Railway cellars thick with coal dust and the smell of sweat. Barracks where the walls swallowed screams as though they were steam. In Petrograd, prisoners were lined up on the banks of the Neva, executed at night, and pushed beneath the river ice. In Crimea, mass shootings echoed from the cliffs. In Moscow, cellars of the Lubyanka filled with men who prayed not for rescue, but for the courage to face the next dawn. Chekists worked in shifts. Bullets ran out. New methods were invented. And through it all, the official newspapers applauded, explaining to the public that this was the cleansing of the old world and the necessary discipline of a proletarian state. Terror was not a lapse of judgment. It was a blueprint. The psychology of a revolution without mercy. What transforms ordinary men into executioners? What turns clerks into interrogators and students into jailers? In 1918, the answer lay in ideology and exhaustion. Many Chekists were convinced they were saving the world. Many were convinced they were avenging generations of injustice. Many were simply young, hungry, and given power over life and death for the first time in their lives. The revolution had destroyed the old hierarchy, but in its place, it created something far more volatile. A hierarchy of fear. The more ruthless you were, the faster you rose. A trembling hand was a defect. A hesitation was counter-revolution. Mercy was treason. Thus the terror fed itself, growing not only from orders above, but from competition below. Everyone wanted to prove their zeal. Everyone wanted to show they were more loyal than the next man. A revolution fueled by idealism had become a revolution sustained by executions. The soundtrack of a nation in shock. Writers who survived the era describe an atmosphere almost supernatural in its intensity. They write of nights where gunfire became the lullaby of cities. Of streets emptied by curfews, where the sound of car engines meant only one thing: the Cheka had arrived. Of apartments where families slept fully clothed, unsure if the knock on the door would come for them. People stopped speaking openly. Then they stopped speaking privately. Then they stopped thinking freely, because thought itself became a risk. Better not to know, people whispered. Better not to ask. The language of daily life contracted into safe phrases, safe smiles, safe silences. It was the birth of a new Soviet habit, the one that would define the century. And yet the whites were no better. No historical truth is simple. No side in this war held clean hands. For as the Red Terror unfolded, the White Terror unfolded as well on its own front lines, in its own towns, with its own justifications and its own victims. But this is not the chapter for that. That fire will come later. Here, in the Red Capital in 1918, the terror belongs to the Cheka, because they were the ones with the power to make it official, systematic, ideological. To them, The killings were not cruelty. They were policy. And policies endure longer than rage. The widening gyre. As autumn deepened and winter approached, the terror did not weaken. It sharpened. The prisons overflowed. The trains thundered with shackled prisoners heading to camps far from the cities. Executions were no longer whispered about, they were expected. The people learned a new rhythm of fear. Morning arrests. Afternoon interrogations. Nighttime executions. And after each execution, the same question. Who will be next? No one knew. Not even the Chekists themselves. The revolution had devoured its first generation of enemies. Soon, it would begin eating its own. But before that began, the Bolsheviks created an institution whose shadow would shape the next 7 decades. The military counterintelligence apparatus, the Bolsheviks. Transition to Chapter 8. For terror needs more than prisons and bullets. It needs eyes. Eyes in the barracks. Eyes in the trenches. Eyes behind the officers as they march into battle. War has many front lines. Some roar with artillery. Some thunder with cavalry. But the most terrifying front of all is silent, invisible, built not on trenches, but on fear. By late 1918, the Red Army had grown into a vast organism stitched together from volunteers, former imperial officers, factory workers, peasants, adventurers, opportunists, and men who simply had nowhere else to go. It was a force held together not by unity of class or ideology, but by a single fragile thread: trust. And trust, in that year, was evaporating faster than snow on a hot railway boiler. Reports reached Moscow constantly. Officers deserting with maps. Commanders handing over artillery positions to whites. Whole companies opening city gates at night. Cossack scouts switching sides twice in a week. Trotsky, riding his armored train from front to front, quickly realized a brutal truth. The Red Army could not survive on politics, nor enthusiasm, nor even terror alone. It needed eyes. It needed ears. It needed a shadow hand that would grip every regiment from within, watching, listening, judging. And thus was born one of the darkest institutions of the Civil War. A force that outlived the war, outlived the revolution, and for decades shaped the psychology of an entire nation. The Bolsheviks, the special men. Agents of the Cheka assigned directly to the army. Political watchdogs. Invisible commissars. The secret nervous system of the Red Machine. A new power steps onto the stage officially. They were the Osobyotl, the special departments of the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission. Unofficially, everyone knew what they really were. They were the men who appeared in camp after dark. Men who asked quiet questions. Men who stepped into a tent and emerged with a folded list. Men whose boots made no sound on frozen ground. Their appearance was never announced. Their departure was never explained. Their decisions were never questioned. To the rank-and-file soldiers, they were phantoms of authority, somewhere between commissars and executioners. To officers, they were a reminder that their lives hung by a single thread. To commanders, they were a warning that the Red Army belonged not to them, but to Moscow. The Cheka had entered the military, and once inside, it never left. Why the Bolsheviks needed the special men? The Red Army of 1918 was not a modern, disciplined force. It was an improvisation. A massive, chaotic experiment. At any given moment, half the officers were former Tsarist professionals, half of those were suspected of plotting betrayals, units moved without orders, deserters traveled in armed bands, supply trains vanished into the steppe. Messages took days to arrive, rumors arrived instantly. It was an army that could crumble if a single regiment lost nerves at the wrong moment. So the Bolsheviks created a system that could compensate for chaos with obedience, for disloyalty with fear, and for weakness with surveillance. Thus, every division, every brigade, sometimes every battalion, received a shadow observer to an Osobist. Their task was simple: watch everyone, trust no one, report everything, intervene when necessary, eliminate when required. And the definition of necessary changed from hour to hour. The silent courtroom of war. There was no formal protocol for dealing with suspected traitors. The Cheka did not operate by legal code, it operated by discretion. A suspicious meeting between two officers. Write a report. A regiment refusing to advance under fire. Arrest the commander. A soldier talking to a stranger on a railway platform. Interrogate immediately. A map missing from headquarters. Bullet to the back of the head. Sometimes the punishment was public to set an example. But most often it was quiet, efficient, and final. Men disappeared in the night. Sometimes their comrades whispered about it. Sometimes no one dared. The Osobasti became the invisible court, a judge, jury, executioner embedded inside the very veins of the Red Army. And strangely, instead of collapsing morale, the system stabilized it. Because in a world where every soldier feared betrayal, the knowledge that someone was watching for traitors became reassurance. Fear, paradoxically, became order. Officers under suspicion, but the group that suffered most under the shadow of the Cheka were the former imperial officers, and the backbone of the Red Command staff, yet also its most distrusted element. Without them, the Red Army would have been a disorganized militia. With them, it became a professional fighting force. But with professionalism came the danger of defection. Every officer had a history. Every history was suspect. Some had served the Tsar. Some had fought the Germans. Some had commanded Cossacks. Some had relatives fighting for the Whites. Some simply looked too polished, too educated, too aristocratic. And the Osobasti watched them relentlessly. There are accounts of officers marching into battle with a Cheka agent assigned directly behind them, not as support, but as insurance. If the officer hesitated, the Osobist was authorized to shoot him before hesitation spread. Courage and fear welded together at the spine. This was the iron cynicism of the Civil War. The price of loyalty. Slowly, painfully, the Red Army grew more reliable. Not because it became more ideological. Not because officers suddenly fell in love with socialism. But because the system of surveillance ensured that defection was no longer an option. For many officers, loyalty was not a belief, it was a calculation. Serve well, and you might live. Serve poorly, and you would not see the sunrise. Some embraced the new order. Some endured it silently. Some attempted escape, and were caught. Some betrayed the Whites out of self-preservation. Some betrayed the Reds under the same logic. Loyalty in 1918 was not a virtue. It was a survival strategy. And the Osobasti made sure that it remained the only viable one. A machinery that outlived the war. By the end of 1918, the special departments were no longer temporary wartime measures. They had become a permanent mechanism of the nervous system of the Red Army, the shield of the revolution, the sword against treachery, the whispered threat in every barracks. And as the Civil War escalated, their power only grew. From the Volga to the Don, from Tsaritsyn to the Baltic, the Osobasti became part of the rhythm of war as essential as ammunition and rations. One soldier later wrote, "We had two commanders, one with a map, one with a notebook. And it was never clear who frightened us more." But while the Cheka's shadow spread across the Red Army, the real test of loyalty, discipline, and terror was taking shape far to the east on the banks of the Volga. There, the Whites struck a blow that shattered the illusion of Bolshevik control. There, a historic city fell, and with it came a wave of chaos that threatened to drown the revolution. It was the battle for Kazan. There are cities that become battles. And there are cities that become symbols. Kazan, in the summer of 1918, became both. Straddling the Volga River like a gate between Europe and Asia, Kazan was more than a strategic point on the map. It was a crossroads of cultures, armies, faiths, and destinies. Whoever held Kazan held the Volga. And whoever held the Volga held the spine of Russia. It was here, on the banks of that broad, ancient river, that the Civil War revealed its true face, not the rumors and shifting borders of previous months, but steel against steel, will against will, belief against belief. The White advance, a lightning strike from nowhere. The attack came with stunning speed. The Czechoslovak Legion, restless, disciplined, and burning with resentment after months of uncertainty, swept along the railway lines like a storm of bayonets and machine guns. Their officers read maps with clinical precision. Their soldiers fought with the cold efficiency of men who had seen too many broken promises. Behind them marched the newly formed White detachments, officers in mismatched uniforms, cadets barely out of school, volunteers from villages hungry for any force that promised order. To the bewildered Red garrisons along the Volga, this coalition seemed to materialize from thin air. One week, the front was a vague line far to the east. The next week, the Whites were at the gates of Kazan. The city braced for impact. Inside the city, fear wears many masks. Kazan in 1918 was a city of contradictions. The Kremlin's white walls glowed above wooden districts so old they seemed carved from memory. Tatar merchants whispered prayers behind shuttered shops. Russian workers huddled in barricaded factories, unsure whom to fear more, Whites, Reds, or their own neighbors. Students carried rifles too heavy for their shoulders. Monks prayed as bullets cracked like firewood outside their cloisters. Women filled bags with bread that might need to last days or minutes. Hunger, fear, hope, and suspicion blended into a single, sour taste. Some inhabitants silently rooted for the whites, believing they would restore lost order. Others prayed for the Reds, terrified that a white victory meant vengeance for every seized estate, every burned manor. Most simply prayed for survival. But the city would not be spared. The fall of a city torn from its defenders on August 6, the whites struck. The attack was not elegant. It was not heroic. It was brutal, chaotic, and drenched in smoke. Czech riflemen advanced street by street, bayonets fixed, shouting commands that echoed off stone walls. White officers led charges with revolvers raised like torches. Red units poorly trained, exhausted, divided by politics and fear crumbled under the pressure. Some fought bravely. Some fled. Some switched sides. Some simply vanished in the labyrinth of alleys. The Volga churned with bodies and broken boats. Warehouses burned, filling the sky with black banners of smoke. Factories exploded as retreating Reds sabotaged their own positions. By nightfall, Kazan fell. The red flag was torn down. The white tricolor rose. And with it, something much darker. White terror, the price of liberation for the city. Liberation came with a grim cost. The White Command, furious at months of Bolshevik rule, unleashed a wave of reprisals. Arrests. Executions. Settling of scores long postponed. Former officials were dragged into the streets. Workers suspected of Red sympathies vanished into improvised prisons. Houses were searched. Looting erupted. Kazan, in the weeks after its fall, tasted the bitterness of white terror just as it had tasted the cruelty of Red control. Two visions of Russia clashed in its streets, and neither vision spared the innocent. The Red response, a lightning forged in chaos, but the victory of the Whites and the Czechs brought them little peace. Far to the west, in the Red heartland, the fall of Kazan tore through Moscow like a shockwave. Lenin raged. Sverdlov demanded retaliation. And Leon Trotsky, fiery, relentless, incandescent with ambition, saw the disaster as an opportunity to reshape the Red Army into a weapon of iron. He summoned those who still believed in discipline. He recruited those who were too afraid to refuse. He threatened those who hesitated. He executed those who fled. And into this furnace stepped Gaya Dmitrievich Gaya, a ruthless, brilliant cavalry commander whose name would soon be spoken with awe or terror, depending on who did the speaking. Under Trotsky's guiding hand, the Red forces began to reform. Regiments were reorganized. Deserters were hunted. Commissars stood behind the lines with pistols drawn. The once shattered Red Army, hardened like steel, plunged into water. Something new was being born, and its first test would be Kazan. The counteroffensive was the birth of the Iron Division in September 1918. The Red Army struck back. Gay's cavalry moved first, swift, aggressive, unstoppable, cutting through white positions like wind carving through grass. Behind them advanced newly reformed infantry divisions whose commanders possessed authority enforced by Trotsky's famous armored train itself. One formation became legendary. The Iron Division, a unit forged from desperation and discipline, held together by a single belief. They would take Kazan back, or they would die on the road to it. Storm after storm, assault after assault, the Reds pushed toward the city. The Whites, unaware of the transformation occurring behind Red lines, expected another disorganized retreat. Instead, they met a force more disciplined than any Red unit before it, a force driven by fury, ideology, and the memory of humiliation. After a week of brutal urban combat, the tide turned. The recapture of Kazan returns to Red hands on September 10. The Reds entered Kazan. Gunfire echoed between empty houses and shattered windows. Bodies lay on bridges, in trenches, in church courtyards. Smoke curled upward from the ruined districts. The Volga reflected not the sky but burning buildings. The Whites fled east. The Czechs withdrew in good order, bitter but intact. The city changed flags again. And with the Red victory came a new round of violence. Commissars hunted collaborators. Revolutionary tribunals worked without pause. Scores were settled with bullets and midnight knocks. For the people of Kazan, the Civil War had delivered not salvation but a terrible lesson. In this war, there was no good side. Only different versions of fear. Kazan would survive. But it would not forget. Transition to Chapter 10. The fall and recapture of Kazan marked more than a tactical victory or defeat. It revealed the shape of the Civil War to come, fluid, merciless, driven by vengeance and ideology, fought as much in the streets as in the human soul. And nowhere would this be clearer than in the south, where Denikin's volunteer army gathered strength for its most daring campaign. From the Volga, our story now turns to the Kuban, to generals, Cossacks, betrayals, and a march that would shake the entire south of Russia. The summer heat of 1918 pressed down on the southern plains like a great molten weight. Dust hung in the air above the steppe, shimmering in ghostly columns. Here, where the sun scorched everything it touched, the White Movement prepared for one of its most daring and brutal undertakings. The Second Kuban Campaign. General Anton Denikin, exhausted but unbroken after months of retreat and chaos, gathered the remnants of the volunteer army. 9,000 men at first, a tiny, hungry force facing a red host nearly 50 times larger. And yet, through sheer willpower and the unrelenting momentum of desperation, this small army grew. Cossack regiments began to rally to Denikin, answering old oaths and older grievances. Soon the force doubled. Sabers glinted in the sun once more. But even with reinforcements, the calculation was madness. The Red forces in the North Caucasus numbered nearly 500,000. Denikin's men knew the truth. They were marching into an inferno. The bloody path to Ekaterinodar, the Kuban steppe, became a field of horrors. Both sides shed any illusion of mercy. Prisoners disappeared without a trace. Mutilated bodies lay under blackened skies. The sun rose on atrocity and set on retribution. Amid this chaos, one name inspired particular fear among the Reds: Ivan Sorokin, the fierce, charismatic commander of the Cuban Soviet forces. He struck with boldness that bordered on suicidal, halting white advances again and again. Even Denikin, usually sparing with compliments for his enemies, admitted Sorokin was a fighter of rare courage. Yet the volunteer army refused to break. They marched forward, step by step, village by village, bleeding for every road and ridge. Ekaterinodar fell first, a defining triumph, a thunderclap across the south. Then came the crucial port of Novorossiysk, pried from red hands after vicious fighting that lasted through days and nights indistinguishable from each other. The Whites reached the Black Sea. For the first time in months, Denikin could breathe. Sorokin's fall but fate in the civil war was cruelly inconsistent. Sorokin, flushed with victories, made the fatal mistake so many self-made commanders had made before him. He began to believe he no longer needed the party. Conflicts flared between him and the Bolshevik authorities. Accusations turned to threats, threats turned to executions. Sorokin shot several of his political opponents, certain his popularity would protect him. It did not. On November 1, 1918, in the city of Stavropol, Sorokin was arrested and executed. The South lost one of its fiercest defenders, but the violence was far from over. The Piatigorsk massacre that same night, in nearby Piatigorsk, another horror unfolded. Local Cheka officials carried out one of the most senseless and symbolic killings of the entire war. 19 hostages, generals, ministers, nobles, were butchered with sabers, knives, and rifle butts. Among them stood General Nikolai Ruzsky, a key figure in the abdication of Nicholas II. Offered life in exchange for serving the Reds, he refused. His executioner later bragged that he had slain Ruzsky with his own hand. The massacre shocked even hardened revolutionaries. It further weakened Red morale in the Caucasus and emboldened Denikin, who soon seized Stavropol, pushing the Red armies back into defensive chaos. A Pyrrhic victory by late autumn, the volunteer army controlled most of the Kuban, the Black Sea coast, and large swaths of the North Caucasus. Against all odds, Denikin's forces, vastly outnumbered, had won a string of stunning victories. But every triumph carried a hidden cost. Casualties mounted. Ammunition dwindled. Supplies had to crawl over endless steppe roads vulnerable to ambush. The volunteer army was expanding, but not fast enough. Spirit alone could not replace artillery shells, locomotives, or trained officers. The South was burning, and Denikin was winning, but only just. As winter crept in, a new front began to crystallize. To the east lay the Don, where the Cossack host under Ataman Krasnov stirred with its own ambitions and resentments. And beyond that loomed a titan of steel and fire. The battle for Tsaritsyn. The storm was gathering again. Night had already fallen over the foothills of the Caucasus. Piatigorsk lay silent beneath the looming silhouettes of Mount Mashuk, its streets deserted, its lamps flickering in the cold autumn wind. Yet behind the shuttered windows, terror moved like a shadow, a silent, invisible, inevitable. The defeat near Stavropol, the fall of Ekaterinodar, the execution of Sorokin, all these blows rattled the Bolshevik leaders of the North Caucasus. Their nerves frayed, their fear sharpened into something darker. The atmosphere inside the local Cheka became feverish, almost delirious. Whispers of spies, traitors, white conspirators grew into shouts. Panic blurred into paranoia. And then, sometime in early evening, a door slammed inside the Cheka building. A decision, a brutal and irrevocable, had been made. 19 men were to die before dawn. The hostages, they were not random prisoners. They were symbols, relics of a world the revolution wished to erase. Among them stood former ministers of the imperial government, aristocrats, and generals who had once commanded tens of thousands. Foremost among them was General Nikolai Ruzsky, the man who had personally drafted Nicholas's abdication. He had been captured months earlier, a living trophy for the revolution. Now he was ordered to step forward. "You may save yourself," a Cheka officer told him. "Serve the Soviet Republic." Ruzsky straightened his back despite his chains. "I serve Russia," he said quietly. "Not murderers." It was a death sentence spoken in his own voice. The descent into savagery. The prisoners were dragged into the courtyard of a small villa requisitioned by the Cheka. Torches crackled. Wind tore at their coats. A white moon cast long bars of light across the ground, like the floor of a prison cell. No formal charge was read. No verdict proclaimed. Someone simply barked, "Begin." What followed was not an execution. It was butchery. Cheka men, many half-drunk and hungry for revenge after the collapse of Sorokin's army, rushed forward with sabers, revolvers, knives, even rifle butts. Lantern light flashed against blades. Shouts echoed through the night, orders, curses, screams. Later, one of the executioners, Agabekov, would boast in his memoirs, "Ruzsky, I cut down myself. When I asked him if he recognized the revolution, he replied, 'I see only a great banditry.' That was enough. Enough to kill a man. Enough to stain a city." The bodies fell one by one. Torches spat sparks. The ground grew slick with blood. And all the while, in the distant city streets, the citizens of Pyatigorsk lay awake in their beds, pretending not to hear the shouts carried by the wind. A shockwave through the south. By morning, Pyatigorsk had become a ghost. Few dared speak. Fewer dared look toward the Cheka building. But word travels even when tongues are silent. The massacre spread through the Kuban like wildfire. 19 high-ranking prisoners were murdered like animals. The whites, advancing from Stavropol, heard the news with a mixture of grief and incandescent rage. Denikin later wrote, "This crime stood beyond war. It was a desecration, a stain on the soul of the South." His officers vowed retribution. And among the rank and file Cossacks hardened by months of brutality, the massacre ignited a desire for vengeance that would burn throughout the next stages of the war. The collapse of Red authority. The Pyatigorsk executions were meant to terrify sympathizers of the old regime. Instead, they fractured the already fragile structure of Bolshevik power in the Caucasus. Soldiers deserted. Committees argued. Commanders distrusted each other. The death of Sorokin had removed the only figure capable of uniting the Red forces in the region, and now the massacre convinced many that the Cheka itself had gone insane. When Denikin's units entered Pyatigorsk 2 weeks later, they encountered almost no organized resistance. The Reds fled in haste. Some disguised themselves as peasants, others threw away their uniforms. Many were captured and summarily executed, and the cycle of revenge grinding onward, unstoppable. The villa where the massacre occurred was found abandoned, its courtyard still bearing dark stains that the autumn rains had failed to wash away. Echoes in the night. One story survived, whispered decades later by survivors of the city. A local priest, hearing the screams that night, left his home and walked to the Cheka villa. Guards intercepted him. "I have come to give the dying their last rites," he said. They pushed him away with the butts of their rifles. "We gave them theirs," one guard spat. The priest returned home, bolted the door, and prayed until morning. He would remember the sound of the sabers until his death. Toward the dawn, toward Tsaritsyn, the fall of Pyatigorsk marked the end of Red power in much of the North Caucasus. Denikin now controlled nearly the entire region. But as he pushed northward, a new storm gathered on the horizon, a confrontation that would define the entire southern front. To the northeast, on the banks of the mighty Volga, the fortress city of Tsaritsyn braced itself for the next chapter of the conflict. There, under the smoky sky, two rising figures of Stalin and Voroshilov had prepared to defend the city with desperation bordering on fanaticism. From the blood-soaked courtyards of Pyatigorsk, the war now marched toward a clash that would reshape the map of Russia. The autumn wind sweeping across the steppe carried more than dust and the chill of approaching winter, and they carried rumors. Rumors of massacres in Pyatigorsk, of Sorokin's fall, of Denikin's triumphant march across the Kuban. And they carried something else as well. The gathering thunder of Cossack hooves. For the Don host, the war had ceased to be a political struggle. It had become a matter of identity, a question of whether the ancient Cossack way of life would survive or be swallowed by the red tide rising from the north. Ataman Pyotr Krasnov, sharp-eyed and embittered, knew this better than anyone. He saw Bolshevism not just as an enemy, but as a force intent on erasing the Don itself. And so he rallied his people. Stanitsas echoed with the clang of sabers and shouted oaths. Old men brought out long-hidden rifles. Teenagers lined up beside veterans of Turkish wars. Krasnov declared the Don a sovereign state, and though few believed the claim would last, the sentiment lit a fire across the region. Yet the Don host stood not as one body, but as two. Some favored Krasnov and independence. Others gravitated toward Denikin and the broader white cause. And between them stood the Red armies pushing southward, bringing with them something even more feared than death. The policy of Raskazachevany, the decossacization campaign. Raskazachevany. A war within a war. It began with orders issued quietly in Moscow, their language as cold as the steel of a commissar's revolver. Entire Cossack villages were to be cleansed of counter-revolutionary elements. Men were deported or shot. Horses and grain requisitioned. Women and children left to starve. The Don turned into a land of burning homesteads. Cossacks who had once served in the imperial cavalry now fought not for tsars or generals, but simply to keep their homes intact. Every outrage committed by red detachments drove more men to join Krasnov or Denikin. The steppe itself felt ready to burst. But the center of gravity in the south was shifting. All eyes turned to the city on the Volga, the place that would soon become infamous across the world. Tsaritsyn. The red fortress Tsaritsyn was more than a city. It was the linchpin of southern Russia, a gateway to the Volga grain routes and the last barrier preventing a white link-up between south and east. If Denikin captured Tsaritsyn, he could unite with Kolchak's forces advancing from Siberia. The entire map of the war would tilt. But Tsaritsyn was defended by two men whose names would one day shape the fate of the entire century: Joseph Stalin and Klymen Voroshilov. Stalin, then a commissar with a coarse Georgian accent and a talent for bending structures of power to his will, had transformed the city into an armed camp. Voroshilov, loyal to the point of fanaticism, forged the troops into a personal army. Together, they created a fortress of trenches, armored trains, artillery nests, and barricades stretching across the horizon. Locals would later whisper that Tsaritsyn had two rulers, the official Soviet authorities, and Stalin's unofficial dictatorship. The rival of Zloba and the Steel Division, yet even the harshest commissar cannot win battles on will alone. What Tsaritsyn needed was shock force, a spear to drive into the enemy's heart. It found that spear in Zloba's Steel Division, a fearsome cavalry unit forged from miners and workers hardened by years of underground labor. They wore mismatched uniforms, carried weapons scavenged from half a dozen fronts, and possessed a reputation for attacking with unstoppable, almost reckless fury. Their arrival in Tsaritsyn electrified the defenders. Stalin praised them as heroes of the revolution. Voroshilov toasted them in barracks and depots. Soon their black banners, decorated with skulls and crossed hammers, fluttered over the defensive lines. To the whites, Zloba's cavalry became a nightmare of faceless riders emerging from dust storms, cutting supply lines, burning outposts, disappearing as quickly as they came. The siege begins. The first white attacks came cautiously. Don Cossacks probed the trenches, tested the artillery, circled the armored trains. But Stalin's defenses held firm. The armored trains, heavily armed and bearing names like Death to the Bourgeoisie, Avenger, and Red Tsaritsyn, prowled the rails like iron beasts, spewing fire across the plains. Then Denikin struck with full force. Columns of infantry marched through the dust. Cavalry thundered down ravines. Artillery pounded the city day and night, shaking buildings to their foundations. Smoke rose in columns that merged with the clouds. Yet Tsaritsyn refused to fall. Stalin imposed draconian discipline. A deserters shot, officers replaced, supplies seized from nearby villages. Voroshilov rallied men on the front lines, ducking bullets with an almost theatrical bravado. The battle devolved into a grinding war of attrition. Trenches were taken and retaken a dozen times. Cossack cavalry charges crashed headlong into machine gun fire. Shloba's Steel Division launched counterattacks that clawed back lost ground at horrifying cost. A city held by fear and fire as weeks stretched into months, Tsaritsyn became a cauldron of hunger, smoke, and unending violence. Civilians huddled in basements. Families cooked thin soups from millet and boiled weeds. Bodies filled makeshift cemeteries on the outskirts of town. Inside the city, Stalin's rule grew harsher. Local officials who questioned his decisions were dismissed, arrested, sometimes simply vanished. Rumors circulated of midnight shootings near the riverbank. Voroshilov's men patrolled the streets, enforcing order with rifle stocks and bayonets. But fear alone did not hold Tsaritsyn. Somewhere beneath the smoke and terror, there was also a belief that the city was more than a strategic point. It was a symbol of resistance, a bulwark against the past. Toward the next storm, Denikin eventually paused his assaults, forced back by exhaustion, winter storms, and supply shortages. The failure to take Tsaritsyn would haunt him, a missed opportunity that might have changed the entire course of the civil war. The conflict now widened. Foreign intervention, white offensives, partisan uprisings, all these currents converged into a single raging river. And far to the north, ships began appearing on the frozen horizon. British Marines, French detachments, American soldiers, Japanese troops landing in the Far East. 14 nations entering the war. Winter tightened its grip on Russia, turning fields into white deserts and rivers into slabs of silent ice. Yet despite the frozen stillness, the war was no longer just a Russian struggle. Far beyond the steppes, in the parliaments of Europe and in the naval bases of the Pacific, decisions were being made that would flood Russia with foreign flags, foreign rifles, and foreign ambitions. It began quietly. A ship sighted off the coast of Murmansk. Another in Archangel. Patrol boats in Vladivostok. And then the truth could no longer be hidden. 14 foreign powers were landing troops on Russian soil. The cold north. British and French in Murmansk and Archangel. The first blow came from the Arctic, where the sun barely rose and the wind cut like a blade. British Marines disembarked at Murmansk in heavy coats, their breath forming clouds in the air. Their commanders spoke of protecting supplies, of preventing German influence, of supporting Russian democracy. But the locals saw something very different. Another army, another uniform, another force claiming to restore order. The British were soon joined by French detachments, then Americans with their sharp accents and naive optimism, and even contingents from Italy and Serbia. Snow fell heavily on their camps, covering the strange spectacle of so many nations gathered at the edge of the world. In Archangel, the first encounters with local Red sympathizers turned into skirmishes. Houses were searched. Suspected Bolsheviks arrested. Entire villages were forced to swear loyalty to provisional authorities set up by the Allies. Whispers spread quickly. A new occupation. The Far East. Japan's shadow over Siberia. If the north was cold, the Far East simmered with a quiet, dangerous heat. Japanese troops landed in Vladivostok with a precision that alarmed even their nominal allies. Columns of impeccably uniformed soldiers marched through the port, bayonets shining, banners fluttering in the wind. They claimed to support the Czech Legion and the anti-Bolshevik cause, but their true intentions were clearer to anyone with eyes. Territory, influence, expansion. Alongside them came Americans, French, Canadians, and even a small Chinese contingent, a bizarre coalition formed more from confusion than unity. Vladivostok became a city of flags, each representing a different agenda, a different hope for carving a piece of the collapsing Russian giant. And in the chaos, warlords emerged. The most infamous among them was Gregory Semenov, the half-mad Ataman who terrorized the Transbaikal region with Japanese protection. His trains armored, adorned with skulls, reeking of smoke and death, became symbols of the lawlessness spreading across Siberia. The tragedy of Ivanovka, but among the many moments of the intervention, one stood out in its horror. The massacre at Ivanovka, a small village near Vladivostok. There, Japanese troops, acting on reports of Bolshevik activity, carried out a brutal cleansing. Houses were burned, men shot without trial, women beaten, children driven into the snow. Villagers fled into the forests, hiding in ravines as gunshots echoed through the night. The next morning, the village was gone, nothing but ashes and smoke rising into the pale sky. The news spread across Russia, fueling hatred and despair. In red newspapers, Ivanovka became a rallying cry. In white circles, it was whispered as a sign that foreign involvement had slipped beyond anyone's control. The West and the South. Odessa and the Black Sea coast far to the south, the Black Sea glittered beneath winter clouds as French warships approached the port of Odessa. Their arrival was greeted not with cheers, but with bewilderment. Ukraine was already torn between the Directory, German leftovers from the Hetmanate, Petliura's forces, and local anarchists. The French added yet another layer to the chaos. They disembarked with military bands playing, officers strutting through the streets as if reclaiming a lost colony. But within days, their confidence shattered against the reality of the Southern Front. Red partisans sabotaged rail lines. Ukrainian nationalists ambushed patrols. Local Greeks and Jews demanded protection. The French command dissolved into confusion. And when the Red Army approached Odessa, the mighty intervention force fled in panic, abandoning weapons, vehicles, even entire stockpiles of ammunition. One French soldier later wrote, "We were told we came to help Russia. But Russia did not want us. And we did not want Russia." Foreign flags, Russian blood in every region. The story was the same. Foreign troops arrived with promises, then became entangled in the nightmare of a war they did not understand. Americans were stunned by the brutality. British officers complained of a land of ghosts and bandits. Japanese commanders quietly expanded their zones of control. French colonels asked why they had been sent to this frozen hell. Each power fought its own private war, often ignoring the others. The result was not a united intervention, but a mosaic of overlapping occupations. Some helped the whites. Some hindered them. Some simply looted. And all of them deepened the hatred burning in Russian hearts. A wider, darker war for the Red Army. The intervention became the ultimate propaganda gift. Posters screamed, "14 wolves tearing at the motherland. Drive out the foreign invaders." And men flocked to the ranks. For the whites, the intervention was a poisoned chalice of offering weapons and supplies, but also undermining their legitimacy among the population. Villagers saw not liberators, but foreign bayonets marching under strange banners. Thus the Civil War expanded, twisted, transformed. No longer merely Russian against Russian, and now Russia became a battlefield for the ambitions of the entire world. But while foreign soldiers froze in Archangel and burned villages in the Far East, a different storm gathered in the heart of Ukraine. The fall of the Hetmanate, the rise of the Directory, the black flags of Makhno, German troops retreating, Petliura forming his own republic, a whirlwind of armies and nations layered atop one another. The collapse began with the sound of hurried boots echoing through marble halls. In Kiev, under the pale November sky of 1918, the Hetmanate of Pavlo Skoropadsky, a fragile state built on German bayonets and bureaucratic dreams, began to fracture like ice under a rising thaw. The Germans, defeated in the West and recalling troops from every corner of Europe, prepared to leave Ukraine to whatever fate awaited it. And that fate approached quickly, carried not by diplomats or ministers, but by thousands of armed men marching beneath the blue and yellow banners of the Directory. The fall of the Hetman Skoropadsky, once a confident ruler in his gold-braided uniform, knew the truth even before his advisors whispered it. Without German support, his government was doomed. His attempt to pivot toward alignment with a future monarchist Russia alienated the very Ukrainian nationalists who had tolerated him. Kiev simmered with tension. Train stations overflowed with deserting German units. Villages braced for a new wave of requisitions and reprisals from whichever army arrived next. The Hetman signed his final decree restoring ties with the one, undivided Russia and sealed his political fate. The Directory forces closed in. After a brief skirmish outside the capital, Skoropadsky fled Kiev disguised as a simple German officer, slipping away under nightfall. His once proud Hetmanate fell apart in hours, leaving behind only bruised memories and abandoned palaces. Into the vacuum stepped Simon Petliura, the charismatic, volatile leader of the Ukrainian People's Republic. But Ukraine was not his to command, not fully, not ever. Too many flags flew over the steppe now. The land of 1,000 armies, winter 19,181,919 turned Ukraine into a living kaleidoscope of factions. German garrisons retreating west. Czechs guarding trains. Red detachments sweeping in from Kharkiv and Kursk. White officers moving north from the Black Sea. Poles pushing eastward. Peasant bands rising and dissolving by the week. And in the center of this storm rode a force unlike any other, the black-bannered, chaotic, unstoppable army of Nestor Makhno. Makhno's black guards in the dusty streets of Huliapol, the peasants spoke of Makhno not as a man, but as a force of nature. Barefoot as a child, hardened in the Tsarist prisons, charismatic despite his rough speech, Makhno had forged a movement driven not by ideology alone, but by raw peasant fury. His cavalry thundered across the open steppe on Tachankas like carriages mounted with machine guns, firing as they raced across fields. Soldiers wore black ribbons, black armbands, black banners emblazoned with stark slogans. Freedom or death. Power to the Soviets without Bolsheviks. Makhno's insurgents liberated villages from German occupation, chased away hetman police, and battled red commissars with equal fury. They executed those who abused peasants, redistributed estates, and held mass assemblies in the open air. To many farmers, they were heroes. To the whites, they were bandits. To the Reds, they were an unpredictable menace. And to Petliura, they were a challenge to his dream of a unified Ukrainian state. Petliura's struggle for Ukraine. Petliura rode at the head of the Directory's forces like a man trying to hold together a tapestry that was unraveling in all directions. His soldiers believed in a Ukrainian nation reborn. They sang and marched with a fierce pride. But they lacked ammunition, railways, and time. Food was scarce. Epidemics raged. Rival commanders acted as warlords. And the Bolsheviks were advancing. Petliura sought alliances anywhere he could with the Poles, with the Entente, even briefly with Makhno. But every alliance carried consequences, and every choice alienated another faction. Ukraine was a land where every decision led to a new enemy. German withdrawal and the chaos left behind. The withdrawal of the German army in late 1918 was not an orderly retreat, it was an exodus. Military trains clogged every railway line. Columns of exhausted soldiers trudged through frozen fields, burning supply depots behind them. Their departure opened the floodgates. Whole districts rose in rebellion the moment the Germans vanished. Estates were torched. Local officials fled. Armed peasants, red agitators, anarchists, nationalists all rushed into the vacuum left by the collapsing hetmanate. The Directory entered Kiev as liberators to cheering crowds. But behind the cheering came looting, score settling, executions, and new requisitions. Kiev, exhausted by years of war, watched nervously. The people knew the truth. The new government might not survive long. The birth of new entities. The ZUNR and the battle for Galicia. Even as Petliura struggled in the east, western Ukraine witnessed another earthquake. The collapse of Austria-Hungary unleashed a new political entity. The Western Ukrainian People's Republic ZUNR, centered in Lviv. Ukrainian and Polish militias clashed in the streets of the ancient city. Barricades sprang up overnight. The gunfire echoed across churches and old stone markets. The Poles fought for their vision of a resurrected Polish state. Ukrainians fought for their own sovereignty. Petliura dreamed of uniting with the ZUNR, but he barely controlled Kiev, let alone Galicia. The Polish-Ukrainian War further splintered any hope of unity. A land torn in 14 directions. By early 1919, Ukraine had become perhaps the most chaotic battlefield of the entire civil war. No side truly controlled the land, each clung to scraps. The Reds gained Kharkiv and Poltava. The Whites took the Black Sea coast and moved toward the Donbas. Petliura held Kiev only by miracle and momentum. Makhno carved out a free territory in the southeast, governed by local councils. The Poles occupied Galicia. Foreign forces appeared in Odessa and Kherson, only to flee at the first Red advance. Ukraine, rich and wounded, became the ground on which empires and ideologies collided. And yet, amid this chaos, one figure in Warsaw watched closely. A man with sharp eyes, a sharper mind, and ambitions that stretched from Vilnius to the Black Sea. Jeff Pilsudski. He would shape the next stage of the war. The snows came early to the forests of Belarus and Volhynia. Thick drift settled between the pines, muffling sound and casting a soft glow under the pale winter moon. But beneath that calm beauty, an army was gathering, an army with a vision that stretched far beyond the frozen rivers and sleeping villages. At its heart stood Józef Pilsudski, the man who dreamed not simply of resurrecting Poland, but of shaping Eastern Europe itself. Where others saw chaos in the collapse of empires, Pilsudski saw opportunity, a chance to forge a federation of peoples between Germany and Russia, a great buffer state that would guarantee Poland's survival. But to achieve that dream, he needed territory. And to seize territory, he needed war. Poland rises from the ashes. The end of the Great War had thrown open the gates of history. In Warsaw, crowds surged through the streets as German troops marched out. Flags of white and crimson blossomed from windows. Soldiers returning from the Western Front embraced their families. Poland was free for the first time in over a century, and Piłsudski, newly released from Magdeburg prison, was swept into power as chief of state. Yet freedom brought no peace. Poland's borders did not exist. Every neighbor pushed, pulled, and suspected. Germany to the west, Czechoslovakia to the south, Bolshevik Russia to the east, Lithuania to the north all claimed pieces of the land Piłsudski believed should belong to Poland. He prepared for war on all fronts, but his eyes lingered longest on the east. The east. A land without masters, Belarus and Ukraine, ravaged by battles between Reds, Whites, nationalists, and bandit bands, lay open like a wounded animal. No state held stable control. Entire districts lived under the rule of whatever army had passed through most recently. This vacuum suited Piłsudski's plans. In late 1918 and early 1919, Polish troops, still wearing patched German uniforms, armed with mismatched rifles, hardened by years of foreign service, advanced eastward. They moved cautiously, but steadily, into a land where villages welcomed them as liberators or cursed them as invaders, depending on the last occupation. Snowflakes drifted onto white eagles embroidered on their caps as they crossed into contested Belarusian forests. The crack of rifles echoed among the birches. Soviet detachments broke and ran. Local white commanders tried to negotiate alliances, hoping Poland would join their crusade against Bolshevism. But Piłsudski had no interest in being anyone's junior partner. He fought for Poland and for the frontiers he imagined in his dreams. The shadow of Brest-Litovsk, the chaos was intensified by the ghosts of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the hated document that had given Germany enormous swaths of Russian territory in early 1918. Although the treaty was now void and dissolved along with Germany's empire, the borders it had sketched lingered like scars. Polish commanders used the old German maps. Soviet commissars denounced the treaty in speeches. White officers insisted that any Polish advance was theft of Russian land. And yet no one could say where the new borders truly lay. Some villages pledged allegiance to Poland. Others swore loyalty to the Bolsheviks. Others simply hid in their huts and prayed the war would pass them by. The March on Wilno, one city, symbolized the Polish struggle more than any other. Wilno, Vilnius. A place of poets, merchants, rabbis, and revolutionaries, Wilno was claimed by Poles, Lithuanians, Jews, and Belarusians alike. It was a jewel and a wound up for all. In April 1919, Piłsudski launched a lightning campaign to seize the city. His troops advanced with silent determination through forests still heavy with snow. Lithuanian defenses crumbled. Red garrisons retreated eastward in panic. And on April 19, Polish forces entered Wilno to cheering crowds and bitter enemies. Piłsudski declared that Poland had come not as conqueror, but as liberator, a statement that fooled no one. For Lithuania, it was a betrayal. For the Bolsheviks, a provocation. For the Whites, an insult. But for Piłsudski, it was a stepping stone. The Southern Front. Odessa and the Black Sea gamble. Meanwhile, in the south, French officers clinked glasses in Odessa's elegant cafes, pretending they commanded a grand coalition rather than a confused collection of exhausted troops. They had landed to support anti-Bolshevik forces, yet they found themselves surrounded by factions they neither trusted nor understood. Polish units arrived to small detachments assigned to support the Allies. But soon even they realized the intervention was unraveling. In March 1919, as Red forces approached the city, panic erupted. French generals ordered a retreat so hasty that supply depots, artillery, and even armored cars were abandoned on the docks. Thousands of civilians rushed toward the ships, screaming, begging, trampling each other. The Black Sea swallowed the lights of Odessa as the last foreign ships fled. For the Bolsheviks, it was a triumph. For the Whites, a disaster. For Piłsudski, a sign that Europe would not decide the fate of the East. He would need to do it himself. The coming storm between Poland and Russia. By early 1919, the Polish and Soviet armies stared at each other across a long and shifting front line. Neither trusted the other. Both dreamed of expansion. Both claimed to represent the future. In Minsk, red propaganda posters screamed that the Poles were agents of imperialist France. In Warsaw, newspapers warned of a Bolshevik plague creeping westward. Yet full-scale war had not yet erupted. Both sides were too busy fighting other enemies, for now. But the front lines moved closer with each passing week, and small clashes grew into skirmishes that left bodies frozen in the snow. The explosion was inevitable. Toward the next great offensive, as Piłsudski inspected his troops at the end of winter, he sensed it. A storm gathering beyond the forests. A conflict greater than any Poland had faced since its rebirth. A clash not just of armies, but of visions, the Polish dream of a federation against the Bolshevik dream of revolution sweeping across Europe. And in the south, another storm gathered. The White advance under Denikin, marching toward Moscow with unprecedented momentum. Two offensives. Two visions. One collapsing Russia between them. The summer of 1919 rose over the southern steppe in a blaze of heat, as if the sun itself wished to scorch away the last remnants of order. Dust spiraled into the air in long twisting columns. Horses collapsed along the roadside. Villages lay empty or burned to blackened skeletons. The land had become a graveyard stretching to every horizon. Yet from this wasteland thundered an army of battered, hungry, exhausted, but burning with a fierce and desperate hope. The armed forces of South Russia, led by General Anton Ivanovich Denikin, were moving north. It was the greatest White offensive of the entire Civil War. And for a brief, blinding moment, it seemed as though the impossible might happen. Moscow might fall. The offensive begins in June 1919. Denikin signed his famous directive, an order that became legend and curse alike. March on Moscow. The path to the old capital was long and treacherous, cutting through hostile territory, broken railroads, partisan-infested forests, and cities ravaged by famine. But after a string of victories in the south at Tsaritsyn, Kharkiv, Ekaterinoslav, the morale of the White Army was higher than ever. Columns of infantry trudged along dusty tracks. Cavalry scouts rode ahead, sabers glinting in the sun. Supply wagons groaned under their loads of shells and tinned meat. Officers studied worn maps by lantern light, tracing routes that cut through the very heart of Bolshevik Russia. Denikin believed time was his ally. He did not realize time was his enemy. The cities fall. Kursk, Oral, Kiev. The advance was breathtaking. Kursk fell first, after a brief but savage fight on its outskirts. Red troops retreated in disarray, leaving behind broken guns, burning depots, and bodies piled in railway yards. The city welcomed the Whites with cautious hope, peasants bringing bread, priests ringing bells, women waving scarves from shattered windows. Denikin pressed on. Kiev was next. The ancient capital, exhausted by months of occupations, German, Hetmanite, Directory, Bolshevik, had changed hands once again. The Whites marched through its wide boulevards as though through a dream. Flags were raised. Churches reopened. Music drifted across the Dnieper. For a moment, it felt like the old world returning. But it was an illusion. Behind the cheering crowds lurked hunger, resentment, divided loyalties. Partisan bands roamed the countryside. Ukrainian nationalists struck supply lines. Petliura regrouped. Bolshevik agents slipped into the city to fan the fires of unrest. And still the Whites marched onward, toward the ultimate prize. By late summer, White cavalry patrols reached the outskirts of Oral, only 320 kilometers from Moscow. Panic swept the Bolshevik leadership. Posters urging resistance appeared overnight. Factories shut down, their workers were armed and sent to the front. The Red Army trembled and then steeled itself. The Maimonov raid. Glory and disaster as the main White columns advanced north. One of the most daring cavalry commanders of the war, Konstantin Maimonov, launched a raid behind enemy lines that would echo across history. With 10,000 horsemen, Maimonov broke through Red positions near Tambov and erupted into the Bolshevik rear like a flaming arrow. His Cossacks cut railroads, burned depots, ambushed trains, and seized entire towns before the Reds even realized what was happening. Villagers described the raid as if a storm had galloped across the earth. One peasant later recalled, "They came at dawn and dusk, sabers, shouting like thunder that had taken the shape of men." But the raid was undisciplined, chaotic. Many Cossacks drifted into looting and drunken revelry. Valuable supplies were destroyed instead of captured. Instead of joining Denikin's main army, Maimonov veered off course, wasting precious time and strength. The raid terrified the Reds but failed to cripple them. Trotsky's panic and his resolve when news reached Moscow of the White approach, Leon Trotsky reportedly turned pale. Denikin's forces were closer to the Kremlin than any enemy had been since the time of troubles in the 17th century. Red propaganda spoke of the enemy at the gates. Evacuation plans were drafted. Bolshevik institutions prepared to flee east. But Trotsky, commander of the Red Army, soon regained his composure. Traveling by armored train, he raced from front to front, delivering fiery speeches that whipped demoralized soldiers into new resolve. He reorganized units, purged unreliable commanders, and pulled fresh reserves from deep inside Russia. In desperate hours, the Bolsheviks discovered what they had long lacked: unity under pressure. The turning tide as the Whites advanced, cracks began to show. Their front was too long, too thin, too dependent on railroads they did not fully control. Ammunition dwindled. Horses died by the thousands. Supply trains vanished into partisan-infested forests. Officers quarreled. Corruption seeped through the ranks. Meanwhile, the Red Army grew stronger, fed by a population terrified of a White victory and enraged by foreign intervention. Fresh divisions arrived daily. Latvian riflemen, Red Cossacks under Budyonny, workers' regiments from Moscow and Petrograd. The turning point came in October 1919. Red Cavalry under Semyon Budyonny, newly organized into the legendary 1st Cavalry Army, struck the Whites with the force of a hammer. Their sabers cut through exhausted Don regiments. Town after town fell. Railway stations, once crowded with White trains, filled with burning wreckage. The dream of taking Moscow began to crumble. Hope and despair on the road north still. For a moment a heartbeat in history, the White Army saw the golden domes of Russian churches rising in the distance and believed the road to Moscow might still open. But belief cannot defeat exhaustion. By November, Orel was lost. Kursk followed. The long columns that had marched north now staggered south in retreat, ragged and hollow-eyed. Snow began to fall on the abandoned supply wagons. Cossacks rode with slumped shoulders. Officers burned maps they had once studied with shining eyes. Denikin watched it all with grinding agony. The offensive had failed. The greatest chance to topple Bolshevik power had slipped away like dust through fingers. Toward collapse as the Whites reeled southward, another force stirred behind their lines, one that would strike not with honor or cavalry charges, but with sabotage, mutiny, and betrayal. Anarchists, rebels, partisans, and among them, the black banners of Nestor Makhno, preparing to hit the White rear like a hammer. The southern front was unraveling. The dream of Moscow was dying. The southern plains were already deep in autumn when the sound first appeared, a low, distant rumble, like thunder crawling across the horizon. At first the White soldiers thought it was a storm. But storms do not bray like warhorses, nor scream with wild, triumphant voices. It was cavalry. It was Budyonny's 1st Cavalry Army, the new, terrible blade of the Red Army. And with its arrival, the last hopes of Denikin's march on Moscow began to die. The birth of a legend, Semyon Budyonny, with his thick mustache and booming laugh, hardly looked like the architect of a military revolution. A peasant from the Don, a former Tsarist cavalryman, he moved with the ease of someone born in the saddle. But beneath his rustic charm lay something dangerous. Fierce discipline, absolute loyalty to the Red cause, and an instinct for war that bordered on genius. Trotsky had seen it early. Voroshilov praised him endlessly. Stalin, remembering Tsaritsyn, would later lift him to mythic heights. But now, in the late months of 1919, Budyonny was not yet legend. He was simply a commander with 27,000 horsemen, hardened by battles in the Donbas and eager for vengeance. They rode under banners of blood-red cloth, sabers sharpened to a razor edge, machine guns mounted on carts. Their attacks were so fast that villages sometimes saw them only in the moment they thundered past dust clouds, shouting, hooves, and then silence. To the White soldiers, they became a nightmare whispered at campfires. The Reds are coming on horseback. No trenches will save us. The first hammer blow, the collapse began near Voronezh. White units, already stretched thin from months of advance, suddenly faced a force they could not match. Budyonny's cavalry hit them on the flank with the force of a falling mountain. Machine guns rattled. Sabers flashed. White officers shouted orders swallowed by the chaos. Within hours, entire regiments dissolved. Cavalry charges by Don Cossacks, at once the pride of the steppe, chattered like glass against the disciplined hurricane of the Red Horsemen. One White officer wrote in his diary, "We had seen cavalry before, but never like this. They came as if they were the wind itself." The red tide surged forward. Makhno, the blade in the back as the Whites reeled from Budyonny's strike. Another danger rose in their rear, a danger wearing black banners and grinning behind a cloud of dust. Nestor Makhno. Though he had once cooperated with Denikin against the Bolsheviks, the alliance had melted into betrayal, executions, and blood. Now Makhno's anarchist army, tens of thousands strong, launched a brutal campaign against White garrisons in the rear. Tachankas raced across the steppe, firing on supply trains. Railway bridges were blown apart. Hospitals were raided. Convoys were ambushed at dusk. The Whites found themselves trapped between two storms: Red cavalry from the north, Black insurgents from the southeast. Denikin's vast territory, held together by the thinnest of lines, suddenly collapsed like rotting cloth. The long retreat begins by early November 1919. The dream of taking Moscow was dead. Now the Whites fought simply to survive. Retreat columns stretched for miles of wagons, artillery, stragglers, wounded men limping beside exhausted horses. Snow fell in heavy wet clumps, soaking uniforms and extinguishing campfires. The wounded groaned. Children cried. Civilians followed the army in desperate, ragged caravans. Budyonny showed no mercy. His cavalry pursued relentlessly, cutting off stragglers, seizing towns before the Whites could fortify them, turning every retreat into a rout. The sound of red bugles at dawn became a terror the Whites could not shake. The southern front, at once wide and triumphant, shrank into a thin strip of burning villages. Denikin's desperation. Denikin watched this unfolding catastrophe with a heavy, hollow gaze. The man who had once commanded 1,000,000 square kilometers now commanded only retreat routes. He begged the Don Cossacks to stand firm. He pleaded with his generals to hold the line. He wrote frantic orders that evaporated in the chaos. The army was dying before his eyes. Starved of ammunition, clawed apart by partisans, hammered by Budyonny, stabbed in the back by Makhno, and worst of all, the hopeless. One general suggested retreating to the Don and making a final stand. Another hinted at evacuating to Crimea. Others whispered that Denikin should resign. He refused. For now, the last stand at Rostov. As the Whites staggered south, the city of Rostov-on-Don became the final barrier. If Rostov fell, the gateway to the Caucasus and the last White stronghold in the south would open. The fighting was apocalyptic. Street-by-street combat. Cavalry charges through burning suburbs. Machine guns rattling from windows. Bodies frozen on the banks of the Don River. But Budyonny's army was unstoppable. By the end of December, red banners flew over the city. The White retreat became a flood. The clash of titans ends and a new war begins. The march on Moscow, the greatest White offensive, was over. Broken, shattered, left in ashes on snow-covered roads. In its place rose a new stage of the war. One fought not in the plains of Ukraine or the forests of Belarus, but across the frozen expanse of the Urals and Siberia. There, the White movement's eastern pillar, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, was making his own desperate push, supported by the last hopes of the Entente. But discipline was collapsing in his ranks. Rumors spread like plague. Tanks and weapons from the Allies vanished into the taiga. Siberia trembled. Siberia in winter is not merely a landscape. It is a verdict. The wind that sweeps across the frozen taiga carries the weight of centuries, howling through pine forests, bending telegraph poles, erasing the footprints of armies within hours. In early 1919, it carried something else as well as the echo of marching boots, clattering rifles, and the heavy engines of armored trains. It carried the hopes of the last great White leader still standing, Admiral Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak, supreme ruler of Russia. The fate of the East and perhaps of all Russia has seemed to rest on his shoulders. The supreme ruler Kolchak was not a natural dictator. He was a naval officer, a polar explorer, a scientist, a dreamer. The sea had shaped him, discipline had molded him. And yet Siberia, fractured by rebellions and haunted by tyranny, had thrust him into supreme power. He accepted it reluctantly, almost grimly, believing it to be a duty rather than an ambition. His officers adored him, his enemies underestimated him, his allies abroad placed their final bets on him. France, Britain, the United States, Japan all sent Kolchak weapons, ammunition, tanks, machine guns, advisors, money. The Eastern Front seemed poised for a decisive turn. For a moment, Siberia trembled with possibility. The Great Spring Offensive in March 1919, Kolchak launched his grand assault. 3 massive columns surged westward across the Urals, aiming to link up with Denikin and choke the Bolsheviks between two White fronts. It was bold. It was ambitious. And for a few weeks, it worked. Red lines crumpled. Towns fell in rapid succession. Factories, rail hubs, and depots changed hands overnight. The westernmost White units reached the Volga. Kazakhstan's steppe reverberated with the thunder of artillery. The Bolshevik press warned of the Siberian threat. Lenin himself admitted that if the Whites crossed the Volga in force, the revolution could be lost. The East held its breath. But Siberia had other plans. Kolchak's army was vast in territory, but thin in discipline. Many units were composed of former POWs, Czech defectors, peasants resisting red requisitions, and irregular Cossack hosts. They marched not with unity, but with suspicion of one another. And as they advanced, something began to unravel. Rumors, whispers, stories carried by the wind. Kolchak will restore the old landlords. They will punish the villages for rebellion. The whites are coming to take the grain. Whether true or false, the rumors spread like wildfire. Villages that had greeted the whites with bread and salt one week were shooting at their patrols the next. Siberia itself seemed to rebel against the supreme ruler. Foreign weapons, empty stomachs. Kolchak's armies were armed better than any other white force. They had British tanks, American rifles, Japanese ammunition, French instructors. But none of these gifts solved Siberia's greatest problem: logistics. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the fragile spine of the Eastern Front, could carry only so much, and partisan bombing sabotaged it almost daily. Snow buried the tracks. Coal shortages halted the trains. Entire divisions went hungry for days. And worst of all, corruption spread through the supply administration like disease. Officers sold Allied weapons on the black market. Commanders skimmed food intended for their soldiers. Railway chiefs demanded bribes simply to move a train. Kolchak, upright and honest to the point of rigidity, was blind to the rot beneath him. The red counterstroke in late spring, the Bolsheviks had reorganized. Trotsky's armored trains roared across the rails. Fresh divisions, well-fed, well-armed, hardened by the Southern Front, arrived in the Urals. Then came the counterattack. It hit like an avalanche. White lines, thin and stretched, could not hold. Red cavalry tore open the flanks. Infantry stormed trenches. Partisans cut telegraph wires and blew up bridges. Rumors magnified every setback. Kolchak is retreating. The supreme ruler is fleeing. The Allies are abandoning us. Fear spread quicker than orders. Retreat into the white wastes. The White Army, which had reached the Volga with such hope, now staggered back across the Urals in a ruinous, disorganized retreat. Thousands froze to death along the rail lines. Others died of typhus at the great, invisible killer of the Civil War. One officer wrote, "The snow was white, the sky was white, the faces of the dead were white. Siberia swallowed us whole." Kolchak rode in his staff train, grim and silent, trying to hold the line with decrees that no one obeyed. His officers remained loyal, but their men slipped away in the night. Villages refused him shelter. Partisans ambushed his supply wagons. Entire regiments disintegrated. The crumbling of the eastern white state. As Kolchak retreated, the political order behind him collapsed. OMSK erupted into riots. Officials fled with gold and valuables. People's armies formed and dissolved within weeks. Czech Legion soldiers, once Kolchak's backbone, now only wanted one thing: to go home. The dream of a white Siberia died slowly, painfully, like a fire starved of air. Even foreign powers began to pull away. The Americans demanded neutrality. The British cut supplies. The Japanese supported only warlords who served their interests. Kolchak stood increasingly alone, a symbol of a fading world struggling against a storm too powerful to resist. Toward the final winter, by late 1919, the Eastern Front was a catastrophe. The White Army was in full flight. Cities fell one by one. The Trans-Siberian Railway turned into a desperate river of refugees. Yet in this darkness, one last tragedy and one final legend awaited. The retreat would become known as the Great Siberian Ice March. It would claim thousands. It would redefine suffering. It would produce heroes, martyrs, and ghosts. And at its center stood General Vladimir Kapel, leading his frozen soldiers through blizzards, across rivers, through death itself. His march would mark the beginning of the end and the beginning of a myth. Siberia does not forgive weakness. It does not bend, and it does not pity. In the winter of 19,191,920, as blizzards howled across its endless white deserts, the last remnants of Kolchak's once grand army discovered this truth with a cruelty almost biblical. The Eastern White Front had collapsed. Cities that once proclaimed the supreme ruler's laws now flew red banners. The Trans-Siberian Railway, that fragile artery linking Europe to the Pacific, had become a lifeline for refugees, clogged with trains overflowing with wounded soldiers, weeping families, orphans clutching sacks of frozen bread. Snow choked the tracks. Typhus stalked every station. And at the center of this unfolding catastrophe marched a man whose name would become legend. General Vladimir Kapl. The death of a state OMSK fell first not to a heroic battle, but to panic, corruption, and betrayal. Government officials loaded trains with gold and furniture while soldiers tried to fight their way on board. Civilians stormed warehouses. Smoke rose from burning depots. Kolchak, solemn and exhausted, evacuated with the remaining white gold reserves under the protection of the Czech Legion, a man who had no desire to fight anymore, only to go home. Behind him, the white political system crumbled like thin ice. Typhus swept the refugee camps. Railways froze. Supply depots vanished into partisan hands. Warlords emerged in the shadows, Semenov, Kalmykov, Popelyev carving out their own fiefdoms amid the anarchy. Siberia became a mosaic of fear, hunger, and retreat. And through this ruin marched Kapel's army. Kapl takes command. Kapl had not been the highest-ranking general, but he possessed something rare in Civil War Russia: absolute trust from his men. He was fearless, austere, selfless, the kind of commander who rode at the front in blizzards and refused a warm coat if his soldiers lacked one. His officers worshipped him. His rank and file followed him with the devotion of medieval retainers. As white headquarters dissolved into chaos, Kapl took command of what remained of the Eastern Army, a tattered, freezing force barely holding itself together. Their goal was desperate and simple: reach Cheka, link up with the Japanese-controlled zone, and survive. But between them and salvation stretched thousands of kilometers of frozen wilderness. The Siberian inferno. It began as a retreat. It became an odyssey. Then it turned into a living nightmare. Blizzards erased the horizon. Temperatures plunged below 45 degrees. Wind cut through greatcoats as if through paper. Soldiers froze in their sleep. Horses died standing where they were tied. Children pressed their faces into their mothers' coats and did not wake. Wolves followed the columns, closing in at night. Partisans ambushed from the forests, fading into the white gloom before the whites could return fire. And still they marched. Sometimes they made only 5 kilometers a day, sometimes less. The crossing of the Kama and the Votkinsk nightmare at the Kama River, the retreat nearly ended. The ice beneath their boots trembled like a living beast. Some wagons broke through, sinking silently into black water. Screams echoed across the river, swallowed instantly by the wind. Those who survived dragged themselves onward, half mad from hunger. At Votkinsk, typhus hit the column. The disease carried off hundreds each day. Men who had survived bullets, frostbite, and starvation, now reduced to delirium. Kapl rode between the sleds, giving water, blessing the dying, whispering encouragement to men who could no longer feel their hands. He never spared himself. This would be his undoing. Kapl's ordeal during the crossing of the frozen Kan River. The ice cracked beneath Kapel's horse. The general plunged into icy water up to his chest. Officers dragged him out, but the damage was done. Frostbite ate into his legs. Infection set in. Each march step became torture. Still he refused to be carried. Still he issued orders from horseback when he could. Still he insisted, "If I fall, the army falls." His men wept openly when they saw him. In their eyes, he was not simply a commander. He was the pillar holding their world upright. The endless white column. By January 1920, the ice march had swollen into a procession tens of kilometers long. Soldiers, civilians, stretcher-bearers, carts, broken artillery pieces dragged by half-dead horses. Lanterns moved through the night like fireflies on a frozen sea. Survivors later said the silence was the worst. For hours, the only sound was the crunch of ice beneath boots. Thousands of boots, thousands of souls moving as one through the abyss. Then, slowly, the column began to shrink. Starvation, disease, cold, exhaustion. Siberia took them one by one. The end of Kapl near the village of Ivankovo. Kapl could go no farther. His officers, pleading, placed him in a sled lined with straw. His feet had turned black. His voice had gone weak. But his will remained iron. He dictated his final order to continue the march, reach Cheka, and preserve the army's honor. Then he whispered, "Russia must be saved." He died shortly after. His men carried his body for hundreds of kilometers, refusing to bury him in land conquered by the Reds. For them, he had become a symbol, the knight of the old Russia marching through the snow long after death. The last steps of the ice march. By February, the survivors reached Cheka, frostbitten, skeletal, broken. Of the tens of thousands who had begun the retreat, only a fraction remained. The ice march became legend. A tale of endurance, a testament to suffering, a requiem for the Eastern Whites. And at its end waited the greatest tragedy yet. The capture and execution of Admiral Kolchak, the collapse of his government, and the final unraveling of the White Dream in Siberia. The winter had done what no army could. The winter of 1920 pressed down upon Irkutsk like a shroud. Snow drifted through the streets in slow, weary spirals. The Angara River, half frozen and rimmed with jagged ice, groaned under the weight of the season. In the dim lamps of the city, one could almost believe that time itself had stopped. But time had not stopped. It was merely waiting for the end of a man, and with him, the end of an entire world. The final journey of the supreme ruler Admiral Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak, former commander of the Black Sea Fleet, polar explorer, scientist, and now the defeated supreme ruler of Russia, arrived in Irkutsk not as a leader, but as a prisoner. His train, once a mobile headquarters adorned with allied officers and hopeful couriers, now rattled into the depot under guard. Snow caked the wheels. The carriages were dark. There were no salutes, no dignitaries, only silence, and the hard eyes of socialist revolutionary rebels who now controlled the city. The Czech Legion, exhausted and eager to return home, had agreed to hand him over in exchange for safe passage. A final, bitter betrayal for simply the last cold transaction of a war that had consumed all honor. Kolchak stepped onto the platform with a slow, deliberate dignity, his face pale from months of retreat. In his hands he carried nothing. Everything else of authority, army, state had already been stripped away. Interrogation. In the White House he was taken to the White House, the government building now serving as the headquarters of the Irkutsk political center. There, under dim lamps and the smell of damp paper, a tribunal of left SRS and Mensheviks questioned him. The admiral answered calmly, sometimes even gently. He confessed no crimes. He begged for no mercy. He asked for no rescue. Instead he offered one thing only. An explanation of duty, of sacrifice, of the impossibility of choices made in chaos. To his interrogators, he seemed both tragic and anachronistic, the man misplaced in time, still carrying the old code of honor in a world that no longer recognized it. Outside, Irkutsk grew restless. Bolshevik forces approached from the west. Rumors spread that the city would change hands at dawn. The tribunal, fearful of what the Reds might do if Kolchak lived to be paraded as a trophy, made a decision that would echo across history. The execution on February 7, 1920, a guard woke Kolchak in his cell just before dawn. The corridor was lit by a single lantern. The air was bitter cold. He was told his fate. No trial, no ceremony, no appeal. Kolchak listened without flinching. He nodded once. When offered assistance to stand, frostbite and exhaustion had weakened him, he refused. "I can walk," he whispered. A Russian admiral does not need help. He walked out into the night. Snow crunched beneath his boots. A line of red soldiers stood by the frozen riverbank, rifles ready. Beside him stood Viktor Popelyev, his loyal prime minister, captured and condemned with him. The two men exchanged a brief glance, not of fear, but of comradeship. A command was shouted. The rifles cracked, and the bodies of the last supreme ruler of Russia and his minister fell onto the snow, the sound muffled by the wind. The guards pushed the corpses beneath the ice of the Angara, where the current carried them away into darkness. Thus ended the White Dream in Siberia, not with a battle, not with a treaty, but with the quiet splash of water beneath ice. The collapse of the Eastern Whites with Kolchak's death, his government disintegrated. The last loyal generals hurried east, only to be scattered by Red advances or swallowed by warlord conflicts. The Czechs finally boarded their trains to Vladivostok. Allied missions sailed away. Japanese troops entrenched themselves further into the Far East, but now only for their own interests. The Trans-Siberian Railway, once a symbol of white control, became a conduit for Red divisions pushing inexorably eastward. In Cheka, the remnants of the Eastern Army awaited orders that never came. No supreme ruler. No united command. Only silence. The civil war in Siberia was over. The turning of the war Kolchak's fall marked a decisive moment. The White Movement had lost its eastern pillar. Denikin's southern front had already collapsed. The northern intervention had failed. In the west, Poland prepared for its own confrontation with the Bolsheviks. But none of these forces, not Denikin, not Yudenich, not the foreign armies, not Kolchak, had managed to break the Red Corps. Now, with the Volga secure, the Urals occupied, and Siberia falling like a line of dominoes, the Bolsheviks concentrated their strength. Factories in Moscow and Petrograd roared to life. Political commissars rebuilt shattered divisions. Budyonny's cavalry surged across the steppes like a crimson tide. From Archangel to the Caucasus, the Whites retreated toward the last defensible corner of European Russia, Crimea. There, behind the narrow neck of the Perikop Isthmus, a new commander prepared to assume the final burden of the anti-Bolshevik struggle, a man austere, brilliant, uncompromising. General Pyotr Nikolaevich Wrangel. Kolchak's death ended an era. Wrangel's rise would begin the last stand. The war was not over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The Red victory was now only a matter of time.